Hi, how are you? Today we start the podcast Forgotten Songs of Flamenco with a great episode because precisely today, January 6, marks the 200th anniversary of the first news of one of my favorite flamenco palos, the petenera. In this episode, we will discuss in what context the petenera appears and we will hear a petenera of that time. So prepare your cava, champagne, whiskey, mezcal, tequila, whatever you have, because we have to toast for our petenera. Let's start. Sounds that once were listened. Sounds that once were enjoyed. Sounds that once were danced. Sounds relegated to oblivion. Let us summon them. Welcome to the podcast Forgotten Sounds of Flamenco. My name is José Miguel Hernández Jaramillo, and I invite you to enroll in this journey through the sounds, stories, spaces, and people that were part of the 19th century flamenco. Hi friends, my name is José Miguel Hernández Jaramillo. I am from Seville, Spain, and I am a flamenco guitarist. I am a PhD in Advanced Studies of Flamenco at Seville University and a PhD in Ethnomusicology at the National Autonomous University of Mexico. I have been researching this wonderful flamenco music for more than 25 years. First of all, I'd like to thank you for following this podcast, and I'd like to apologize for my English. Maybe my grammar is not the best. Initially, I was going to do this podcast only in Spanish, but due to the lack of information regarding this topic in English, regarding 19th century flamenco, there are a lot of misinformation, many theories, and so I decided to do this podcast also in English. I am delighted to start this project that I have been preparing for years, and I'd like to ask for your support by subscribing this podcast and sharing in your social media. You can also follow the podcast on the YouTube channel Sonidos Olvidados Etnomusicología Creativa, where you can listen to each episode of the podcast and watch the images and documents that are mentioned. And I start the first of the episodes of this podcast precisely today when we are celebrating the 200th anniversary of the first news we know of one of my favorite flamenco palos, the petenera. You can read in some flamenco books that there are references of peteneras before 1823, but they don't indicate the sources of the information. Lenica Reyes and I have searched archives of Mexico, Spain, and other countries, and that of January 6, 1823 is the oldest we have located so far. This reference appears on a poster of the Coliseo Theater in Mexico City, and the petenera was danced between two comedies. It was usual at that time to perform dances or songs called sonecitos del país in Mexico between the representation of different comedies. And although we find it in a theatrical field, it does not mean that it was not also a popular dance. At that time, it was typical for the same dance or song to be performed in different social areas. That is, there was not such a strict barrier between the popular and the ethnic, as assumed generally in music history. Unfortunately, we don't know the music of the petenera that was danced in the Coliseo 200 years ago, but we have the score of a petenera a few years later, from 1827, which probably would sound very similar. This score was published in an article written by the German Karl Sartorius in the state of Veracruz, Mexico. We are going to hear this petenera now, and the interpretation is done by my computer. The flute makes the sung melody. Let's listen to this petenera. About the lyrics of this score, there are 3 couplets. I tried to translate the first one. It's something like this. The petenera, no one knows how to sing it. Only sailors sailing on the sea. Maybe in future I'll prepare a complete episode of this podcast to talk about this petenera of Sartorius. By the way, in the YouTube channel Sonidos Olvidados, you can see a small video that we made time ago about this petenera of Sartorius. In the description of the video of this episode, I will leave the link to the video of the petenera of Sartorius in case you want to watch it. And in what context is the petenera dance in the Coliseo? In 1823, Mexico has just achieved independence from Spain a year and a half earlier. This fact didn't mean the cultural exchange between the two countries was suppressed. Songs and dances from Mexico and other countries of America continued to arrive in Spain, which here were known as American songs. These songs were enormously popular in Spain and came mainly by artistic means and by the sales of musical scores. It is usually said that the sailors were the main transmitters of musical repertoires between Europe and America. Of course, they have their importance, but quantitatively, it was less important than the mobility of artists and musical works and scores. These American songs are very well received in Spain. It was usually the city of Cádiz in the south of Spain who is the first recipient of them. A few years ago, Lenica Reyes and I wrote a paper about this reception of American songs in Cádiz. In the description of the YouTube video of this episode, I leave the link to this paper in case you want to download it and delve deeper into the subject. Faustino Núñez found in the press of Cádiz the first references of the petenera in Spain in 1826, only 3 years after its first references in Mexico. And it is announced as petenera from Veracruz, petenera veracruzana, or American petenera. And when I mention American, I mean the continent, not just the United States. So we have already the music of the petenera in 2 different countries, in 2 different continents. As the petenera became very popular, it was sung with different vocal techniques and instrumentation in each region of both Spain and Mexico, which caused over time that the same song has multiple variants. Flamenco artists began also to sing the petenera, and around the 1870s it became, perhaps together with the malagueña, the most popular flamenco palos at that time. Probably you will not read it in flamenco books. The petenera mostly sung today in flamenco is not the one that was so popular in the 19th century, but the petenera created by Pastora Pavón, La Niña de los Peines, in the early 20th century, a bit slower than the previous version. Although all the variants of the petenera that currently exist in Mexico and Spain may sometimes seem very different, they usually retain common musical and sonic structures. It is, let's say, a kind of musical DNA that is preserved even if the variants change. This allows us, the researchers, to know the transformations of a piece of music is experiencing along several axes: temporal, geographical, social, etc. In our research, Lenica Reyes and I use a type of musical analysis called paradigmatic analysis, which basically, so that you can understand me, extracts the shared DNA of a set of musical pieces that are analyzed together. In another chapter of this podcast, I will talk about how we do this analysis and apply it to the flamenco music of past times. Although the petenera that was danced 200 years ago in Mexico was not really a flamenco petenera yet, I consider that it is essential to dedicate this episode to this anniversary because of the transcendence that the petenera has had in flamenco. I hope you enjoy this episode. Please subscribe it, please share in your social media, and now it's time to have a toast for this petenera. So prepare your wine, your cava, your whiskey, whatever, and for another 200 years of our petenera.